I want to welcome everyone to this webinar, which is sponsored by Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy, or ESEP. I'm Toby Smith. I'm Vice President for Policy with the Association of American Universities. I am also a co-chair of ESEP. So I want to welcome everyone to a discussion we're going to have on engaging the public with science and engineering, communication, conversation, and dialogue. And to lead us in this discussion, we are joined by Emily Cloyd, who is Project Director for Public Engagement at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and Meg Gilley, who is a policy engagement specialist with Compass. By way of background, she'll tell you more. Compass was founded originally to help marine scientists communicate their science. It is much broader, and they help really scientists to effectively engage in public discourse and communicate their work. So I'm going to turn things right over to Emily.
Great. Thanks, Toby. All right. The actual presentation so that there we go. All right. Good afternoon, folks. So I'm going to start with just a general background on what public engagement is and how it's different than science communication. So public engagement is focused on creating intentional, meaningful interactions for talking with the public, talking with policymakers, and really providing an opportunity for everyone involved in that conversation to learn from each other. So, so I like hit the orange arrow so I can actually see the slide. All right, so public engagement, like I said, it's really focused on having that multi-directional dialogue where everyone who is a part of the conversation has standing and is contributing their perspective. And it really provides an opportunity to learn from participants so that as a scientist, you are helping the public learn more about the work that you do, but you are also learning about the public's perspectives, their values, their concerns, in a way that can also help you do your science better. And public engagement doesn't shy away from talking about the benefits and the limits of science and where science and society really intersect. It offers scientific evidence that can help respond to societal issues and concerns, but it doesn't give us all of the answers. And if you think about some of the issues that are right at that science-society interface, whether it's climate change, energy policy, infectious disease, exploring space, science can give us a lot of the information that we need to understand how these things work and the various options that we might have. But science can't tell us whether we should pursue a particular line of policy or how we might fund it or how we might actually do that particular activity. So this is why having public engagement is so important, because it provides that opportunity to have the discussion, have the conversation about how science can inform where we go as a society. At AAAS, one of the ways that we try to help scientists think about this is by using this framework for public engagement, where we have the scientists and their audience as part of this larger ecosystem, where the scientists are providing their message, but they're also learning from their audience, getting feedback from their audience, and adjusting their approach to conversation and engagement. So the first thing that we want scientists and engineers to think about is their goal for engaging with the public. So it could be a big picture goal, something like trying to change policy or trying to change a big problem that society is facing, trying to change that relationship between science and society and bring in that dialogue element. But it could also be a more individual goal. So what do you hope to get out of engaging with the public or engaging with policymakers? What are you hoping to accomplish as part of that engagement? Where are you trying to move the needle on a particular issue? So if you think about the policy ecosystem, the sorts of questions you might engage with are really focused on who is using your science. What levels of policy is your science affecting? So for example, an ecologist might be working on a particular endangered species, and their work might be used by the local land trust to think about how it might make decisions about protecting a particular ecosystem. It may also be used at the national level by policymakers who are thinking about what protections that species might get under the Endangered Species Act, or at the state level, which has similar protections for endangered species. So as you have your goal in mind, as you've started to think about where your science is being used, you also want to think about who your audience is for the engagements that you would like to do. What sort of expertise do they already have? How much science training do they have in their background? What is their professional experience? Are you talking with people who are primarily lawyers, with people who are coming out of a particular policy background, have worked a lot in the policy realm, people who have relatively little policy experience and might not be familiar with the way that your science is interacting with a particular policy question? Knowing your audience is really how you will connect with that audience, because you want to think about their values, their concerns, their interests, and how the work that you're doing might help them do their job better, or how it might help them think about a particular area that they care about, maybe the local park. Back to our ecologist who's thinking about protecting areas for a local endangered species. So really think a lot about your audience, because that's going to help you think about the sort of message that you want to convey and the way that you want to convey it, the kind of engagement that you want to do with that particular audience. So thinking again about where your science is being used, are you hoping to use your expertise to inform policymakers who are actually making the laws in the legislative branch, members of Congress, for example, or are you hoping that your science might be used in actually implementing those laws? So in the Endangered Species Act, making those decisions about what is endangered or not, or how to manage a particular species. It may also be used in the judiciary, so evidence to actually evaluate a law, make decisions, so it could be used in the courts. These same branches of government occur at the state and local level. So again, think about who is playing in each of these different policy places. What are the public groups that might interact with the legislative or the executive branches in your state? And again, at the local government level, if you're working in your community, you might be connecting to people who are working in the public works department. You might actually live next door to a city council person and have a more informal discussion just over the fence about how your work is related to questions that they have in their duties as a city council person. Or you might just be talking to someone who is interested in a local ordinance and they want to understand how the research that you do might be used to support or not support that particular ordinance. And then there's, within the executive side, thinking about who you actually want to talk with. So you may think, oh, I need to talk to the head of the agency because they're the one that's going to have the most pull. So I want to have the big name people as the folks that I'm engaging with. But then you really need to think again, what is the level that your science is being used at? So it may be that you're engaging at the director level, but it's much more likely that you're going to be engaging with someone at the program manager level. Or again, with our endangered species example, you might be talking with the person who is actually making some of those decisions about how to list a species. So you might work with community groups or with groups at the national level that are interested in finding out more about how your work relates to the preservation of a species And then with that group, you may be then contacting the official who's actually making those sorts of determinations. So how will you actually interact? I've mentioned things like making comments when the Fish and Wildlife Service asks for public comment on the listings through a formal notice in the Federal Register, or working with an advocacy or professional organization that might be looking for scientists who can talk more about this particular topic. You also might do things like participate in a public forum at a science museum or a town hall meeting where you're bringing together people from various careers, various interest groups to talk about a particular policy. Or you may be working through the media, maybe writing an op-ed that will ultimately speak to the constituents of a particular policymaker who may then support a particular policy position. There are also more direct interactions, like testifying at a hearing or having a meeting with a particular policymaker or with their staff member. There are a number of ways that you might do this interaction. It could be in person or it could be virtual. It could be a very direct interaction with the policymaker or with a particular targeted audience member, or it may be fairly indirect. So think about where your strengths lie and what makes the most sense for your audience. What sorts of interactions are they already having? Where can you perhaps join in an existing opportunity rather than trying to create something new off to the side? So I'm going to pass it over to Meg for a little bit more background on this.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and thanks Emily for kicking things off. So I'm just going to start by sharing a little bit about Compass, because I'm not sure that all of you are actually aware of who we are and what we do. We are a non-advocacy boundary organization, and our mission is to help scientists more effectively share their science with the rest of the world. And because this is kind of a policy-interested group, part of what we do is help connect credible and salient science with the policy process at the right time and the right places that can make the most impact. So in talking to you guys today, I really want to cover kind of three topics. The first is how to kind of craft this message that's going to be compelling for the public and for policymakers. How to think about navigating advocacy, because that's often a really tricky thing to think about. And then finally, how to really build relationships so that you can kind of over time work with people and kind of work towards your goals. So crafting your message. At Compass, we like to use the message box. It is our way of helping scientists kind of take all of the information they could talk about and sift through and find the pieces that their audience really needs to hear from them, what we call their so what. So your audience is going to say, so what? Why does this matter to me? And hopefully something like the message box can help you kind of think through that. There are other resources that are out there to help you also kind of think through what you're going to say. It doesn't matter what you use, it matters that it works for you and that you can really use it to craft the best message for you. And also realize what is really crucial for your audience to know. I just want to emphasize that. And part of crafting your message is really thinking about your stance on advocacy, which is a little bit tough, I think, to navigate sometimes. So I just have a definition here of advocacy that is public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. I often hear people being a little confused between advocacy and lobbying. Lobbying is a really specific thing that you do often in DC, and it has some really specific legal connotations that I'm not going to get into today, but most of you on the call probably won't actually ever run into that. So instead, it's just maybe easier to think about advocacy or non-advocacy, whether you're going to publicly support or recommend or push for a certain cause or not. And what I want to emphasize about advocacy is this is a decision that you need to make well before you engage in a conversation with anyone about your science. You need to think about where you want to stand on this before you take a step into that room. And there are things to think about. You may want to weigh the risks and rewards of making that suggestion. Maybe your institution has a particular stance on whether you can advocate or not as a representative. of that institution. Maybe you need to be a private citizen if you want to advocate. That is not to say that advocacy is bad or that non-advocacy is good. It is to say instead that there is this spectrum out there and you really need to think about where you stand on it. If this is something you're still kind of struggling with, I know Emily and I are happy to talk through it with you later, and I would also recommend The Honest Broker, which is a book by Roger Pielke Jr., and it's a really great way to kind of help you wrestle with this. And the reality is that advocacy more often than not takes this form when you talk to someone. They might say, so what should we do? And so you just need to be kind of prepared to field that question when it comes in. And you have a lot of different options. You can, at that point, merely present the information that your science tells you and take a really strong non-advocacy position. You can, on the other hand, go in and say, I think you should do this. I suggest you take this specific action and have an advocacy stance, or maybe fall somewhere in the middle and kind of lay out some alternatives and what your science tells you might happen if you took those actions. Again, something to really think about. So I just want to switch gears now and talk a little bit about relationships. You know, I think both when you engage with policymakers and when you engage with the public, it's often kind of a long game that you're playing. It doesn't often end up being, sometimes it's these kind of short interactions, but I think that achieving your goals can often be about engaged interaction over time, which involves kind of building and cultivating these relationships. And that's easy for me to say, but doing it feels a lot tougher. And so I'm going to go over just two quick things to think about that may help you start to kind of build these relationships. And those two things are listening and building trust. So listening. We like to compare listening to maybe driving a car. A lot of people probably think that they're better at it than they are. I think this applies to me very often. But the reality is that listening is a skill, and it's something that you can work on like anything else and get better at. And I think a lot of us might default to kind of professor mode or lecture mode. But sometimes it's important to take a step back and think about if we want to know our audience and understand their values and what they need from us, we really do need to be a generous listener and understand where they're coming from. So I think that oftentimes we'll think about a conversation as kind of a verbal tennis match, that kind of going back and forth and back and forth. But the reality of that is you're not really working towards any specific goal, and ultimately one of you is going to lose, and that is not really what you want. Instead, maybe think about it as a basketball game where you and your audience are on the same team, and you are maybe passing the ball back and forth down the court with the ultimate goal of kind of making a basket where you can both kind of have a win in the end. And, you know, research backs this up. So Anthony Dudo and John Wesley have done some really fascinating research about scientists' interactions. And they've found that positive beliefs about science and scientists are more likely to stem from high-quality interactions with likable and engaging scientists who are willing to listen. So listening is a really key component of this and something to really think about. The other half of that, the high-quality interactions with likable, engaging scientists, also can feel kind of tough. And I think something to think about and a way to kind of build these high-quality interactions is to build trust with your audience. And that's the second thing that I'm going to discuss. And that can feel like a really tough thing to kind of quantify or figure out how to build. But what's great is that researchers have looked into this, and we do have an understanding of some ways that you can build trust with your audience. So Susan Fisk is a researcher at Princeton University, and she has looked into this, and she's found two key components that kind of play into trust, and they are competence and warmth. So as a scientist, if you can bring that to a conversation, competence, meaning that you are you're a resource, that you bring good information, that you're responsive, and that it feels like your science is credible, and that you bring warmth, meaning that not that you're warm and fuzzy or emotional necessarily, but that you kind of bring yourself into the conversation. You're human, you share your passion for your work, your why. It's clear that you come with good intentions. So if you bring both that competence and warmth, you're more likely to build trust with your audience. But ultimately, trust is tends to be kind of a slow thing to build. It takes time and it takes energy. So if you're going to be engaging, whether it's with policymakers or the public, I think it's important to think about the long game that you're going to play, and to think about how both listening and trust can play into kind of building those relationships. And so to quickly recap, I think the main message that Emily and I are sharing today is you really need to do your homework. So much of this is thinking about what you bring into these conversations and the preparation you do before you step foot in the door. So, what is your goal? What do you want to achieve? Why are you engaging in this way? Who is your audience? What power and authority do they have? Can they actually make the change that you want them to make? How will you interact? What's the best way to reach your specific audience? And maybe what's the way that you are a most effective communicator? What is your message? So what is the so what that you're kind of sharing with this audience? And are you going to advocate or not? And finally, how can you build the relationship? So what is the kind of long-term goal that you have with this? How can you be this great resource? How can you bring your science, whether it's the policy process or to the public, so that you can ultimately achieve the goals that you want? So with that, I'm going to put up our contact information so you can check us out, and pass it over to Toby so he can ask us some questions.
Great. So if you do have questions, I believe you have an opportunity to send those in, and we will try and ask those. I have just something to kick this off. Why is it important for scientists to engage with the public or policymakers, but let's just say the general public? I'll start with.
Yeah. So I think that the reason that many of us go into science in the first place is because we want to make the world a better place. But the reality is that just doing our science doesn't actually necessarily get it out to the world to make that change, to make it better. And so I think it's incumbent on all scientists to figure out the places that that they can engage, that they want to engage, the change that they want to make, and how they can make that happen, and maybe where their skills lie, so they can do the best job of that.
Anything?
I think scientists are members of society, just like everyone else. And we have a particular expertise that we can bring to the conversation, but we also have our own interests as people, as members of that civic conversation. And so we can contribute both our expertise as scientists, but we can also be a part of that conversation as people. And we have a stake in the success of our society just as much as everyone else.
So this is a question that's come in online. Is there a difference? So you've talked about public engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a difference between public engagement and then just communicating science, or are they one and the same?
I think the sorts of things that are good practices for science communication, things like knowing your audience and getting a message together that is understandable to that audience and that really makes that audience connect with what you're trying to say, those are the same principles that you have for the broader public engagement piece. But a lot of people focus more on getting that message across and less on that long-term relationship building. And I think that's where the public engagement piece comes in, is adding that relationships to the equation.
So Meg, I have a follow-up, because you talk about listening, and one of the things that I know that is often talked about, and I've heard people like Alan Alda, who of course runs the Alda Center and really promoted this need for scientists to better communicate with the public. He talks about overcoming, and this may be the difference too, because there's communicating science to your colleagues, and there's communicating science to the public, and the people who are not scientists. He talks about the curse of knowledge and remembering what it's like not to know, and how hard that is sometimes for scientists. Do you have any advice on how you actually overcome the curse of knowledge, or how you figure out? You talked about listening. How do you listen to know where to start with an audience that you're just walking to? You don't know what they know and what they don't know.
Yeah, so I think so often it's really tempting to walk into a conversation and just be like, I'm here and I've got my science, let me give it to you, you're welcome. But the reality is most conversations start with, hi, how are you doing? Oh, this weather, it's crazy, you know. You have kids, I have kids, let's talk about that. Maybe we go to the same park on the weekends or whatever. It's about finding this common ground. It's about kind of finding shared values, because often you may not know who your audience is when you walk in, and that can be really tough. But you have the skills as an empathetic human being to learn about them and to listen to them, and then figure out exactly how you can meet them and figure out, of your curse of too much knowledge, you know, which of those nuggets that you can pull out that are going to be compelling to them and that they maybe need or want to hear from you. And I would say that's a great place to start.
So, I'm curious if you're interested in getting engaged, but you're not exactly sure, you don't want to delve in too much. How do you get how might you get your feet wet without really going full bore into public engagement or communicating your science? So, Emily, why don't you start?
Sure. So I think number one is talk to the people around you. So that sort of everyday engagement, whether it's taking a taxi across town and talking to the cab driver about what it is you do, to again, talking with your neighbors, talking with parents at a birthday party where your kids are off playing and you're chatting about what you do and what you're interested in, and it sort of comes up in the conversation. You start to talk about science. Those sort of one-on-one interactions can really help build your confidence, but also help you sort of work out what strategies, what good stories might be to help draw people into that experience of science. The same way that you might use social media like Twitter or Facebook to start with sort of one-on-one interactions or a little bit more, and then as you get your feet wet and you get a little more confident, you can start to do more outreach, bigger events, talking with more people.
I'll add that DC is a really cool, fun place to visit. It can be really amazing to come visit the Hill and have meetings, but the reality is that is expensive, both in cost and in your time, and that maybe isn't right for everyone, and maybe that's not the first step you want to take. I think taking these everyday opportunities is really a great way to start, and maybe you build up to that, and maybe you don't build up to that. Maybe you build to something different that makes more sense for you. I think it's sometimes we just have to open our minds to the easy opportunities around us that we can kind of take, instead of trying to think only about these really tough, difficult things we could do.
So can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
I mean, many people think you have to come to DC, but it's expensive to come to DC to talk to a member of Congress. What might you do instead of coming to DC to have an effect on policy?
Yeah, so I mean, policy happens everywhere, from probably even at your institution that you're at, all the way up to the international level. So, I think participating here at a university, Advocacy University, is doing strategic planning. That's a policy that you can be in, policy-making process you can be involved in. There are plenty of local opportunities. There's state governments in every single state that you can get involved with. If you kind of have this DC bug and you want to work at the federal level, there are also plenty of, offices for DC policymakers or representatives or senators that are in the district. So maybe instead of meeting with your senator and staff in DC, you meet with them in your state, and maybe that makes more sense. I think something to think about is also, does your science make sense to plug in at the federal level? Is it most useful there? Because sometimes it's not. Sometimes your science is going to be most relevant at a more local level, and that's maybe the place that you should think about plugging in.
So I actually just have to add, having worked for a member of Congress, I was always fascinated by how many people flew from the district, from Saginaw, Michigan, to visit with my boss when he was in the district more than he was in DC. And I had some of my best conversations with him on the phone when he was relaxed. He was sitting in his district office. Nobody was bothering him. He didn't run to a vote, didn't have to go to a committee hearing, didn't have to do something, didn't have a full schedule. So I often, they have these fly-ins. I talk about stay-homes because members actually are usually back home more than they are here. Emily, you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I'll also add, when I was in graduate school, we actually had members of Congress who came on field trips and saw the work that we were doing out in the Thousand Islands area of New York State. We actually had Hillary Clinton come take a boat ride around with us because she was the senator for New York at the time. So my experience on the scientist end is members of Congress, mayors, governors, state assembly people, they want to get out in the field and see stuff and really get a sense of the science that's happening. And so that can be a good way to connect with a member or with their staff people, and just invite them to your lab, invite them to your field site.
So questions come in, I think it's really important. How do you, when you are doing very fundamental physics, how do you engage the public in a topic that is really hard for them to grasp and get them excited about it? Who wants to take it?
I've got some thoughts. I'm sure Emily does too. Yeah, that is tough. I think there are a couple of strategies. I think the first is that the people who work on some of the more fundamental research and maybe modeling are things that are hard to hold in your hands. You have to really work on your science communication skills and figure out the kind of maybe metaphors or analogies or way to describe it that's going to be really compelling to an audience that maybe hasn't taken science since high school, and that was a long time ago. So I think that's one thing that you really have to do. The other thing to think about is a lot of these kind of fundamental things have a really cool aspect to them. They are really neat, and people like to hear about it. So to the extent that you can capitalize on that, the cool factor of your work, by all means, do that and share it. And I'd say the final thing I would add is that although you're doing fundamental, maybe basic research, it absolutely funnels into applied research at some point, odds are. So if you can take a step back from your kind of narrow slice of that pie and show people the bigger picture and the role that you play in that big picture, that can be a great way to kind of make it compelling.
And I think building on that, curiosity is something that whether you're a scientist or a teacher or a kid, everybody has curiosity about something. And so building on that sort of shared emotion, everybody knows what it's like to be curious. And tell the story of science, tell that sort of exploration and curiosity and how that's driven the way that you've evolved as a researcher and sort of the questions that you're asking. And, it seems like theoretical physics is something that people might not grasp right away. But my roommate in college worked at Saturday morning physics at the University of Michigan. And that consistently drew hundreds of people every Saturday morning to hear from physics researchers about the work they were doing. And it wasn't just people from the university itself, but it was people who lived in that broader community and who had sort of gotten that curiosity bug. And then that drew them into learning about other new topics in physics. So use that emotion to sort of hook people, and you'll get a much larger audience.
So let me pick up on that, because I think there's a tendency for scientists to start, again, this kind of gets to the curse of knowledge notion, but they start talking about physics and why it matters to them, but I often think, how do you actually, this gets to your listening point, how do you start where physics may matter to not you as a scientist, but where it matters to the individual person? What advice could you give to somebody to really think again, how do I meet them where they're at, where their interests are, and how this might matter to them? Meg, you want to start?
I would say don't start with physics, maybe, and that's okay. Start with something else. I'm kind of repeating my point from earlier, but I think so much of it is about kind of building this kind of relationship first of finding where you have shared interests, and then is there a way to build in talking about your science based on that? And so often I hear from scientists, I don't want to dumb down my work. And the reality is you're not dumbing it down. You are simply giving people, you're meeting them at their level. You are simplifying and not making it simplistic. You are making it compelling for them. So maybe you can't share this teeny tiny band of physics that you work on, because that's maybe not going to be so interesting to them. But maybe what you can do is again, work on and why that might be compelling. And then maybe just drop that you work on this cool, tiny thing that's related to it.
I actually had, a couple weeks ago, I was talking with a physicist at University of Maryland, and she was telling me about how the GPS navigation that we all love to use in our cell phones because we're not quite sure exactly where we are, we're trying to find our way, how that could be related back to Einstein's theory of relativity, and how important it was that we had those theories to help us make the software and make the cell phone that could help us navigate. And I'm not a physicist to be able to describe what that linkage is, but that's something that we can all relate to. Having that cell phone in your pocket to tell you where to go and seeing that relationship back to something that a lot of people, they know Einstein, but they feel like maybe the theory of relativity is too far for them to really apply. But that application was such a great story.
So actually, let me ask you, because I know scientists love to talk about data. They're not always so good about telling stories. And I just wondered if you had advice for if you had the choice between giving data or telling a story, what would you recommend to a scientist trying to engage with the public?
Stories are something that are often much easier for people to connect with. And you can do a really good job of using your data to tell a story, but having that narrative construct is so helpful to get people sort of in with you and moving into that conversation and seeing that story, and then you can start to bring in some of the data.
I agree. Stories are sticky. That's what people tend to remember. That's why we teach kids through stories. And I think a challenge I often hear from scientists is they say, but I don't have a story to tell. I go to my lab, I like to look at spreadsheets, I don't have a story. But my argument is that just like superheroes, every scientist has an origin story. There's a reason you do what you do and that you're passionate and that you show up every single day. So maybe trying to work some of that into when you share your science, that can be really compelling. So maybe think about that.
So Meg, I think one thing you said that's really important is that you have to talk about why you care about science, why you got into science. Oftentimes I think scientists are taught to kind of depersonalize science and be, but that's really oftentimes that personal attraction to science is what kind of pulls people in. It builds that relationship that you both talked about.
Yeah.
So I've heard a figure, I think it's that only 18% of the general public say they have ever met or know a scientist or engineer. So I'm just wondering, are there ways that, how do we overcome that? Are there things, and one of the questions we got was, these special weeks, like engineers weeks, or, other celebrations events, how can those be used to facilitate public engagement and get us past the fact that many people who probably have a neighbor who's a scientist or engineer have never actually talked to them about what they do?
I think a lot of scientists don't introduce themselves as a scientist. They might introduce themselves as a physicist or a botanist, but they don't go back to that bigger category of scientist. And part of that is just us as scientists being honest about the fact that we are scientists. And so when people say, what do you do? Rather than saying, I'm a professor or I'm a grad student, start with, I'm a scientist. I study trees, or whatever that piece might be. And then, work into a little bit more that story of the science. But as you mentioned, some of these, whether it's Brain Week or using a hashtag like actual living scientists on social media, those are ways to, sort of connect to bigger events and to sort of the bigger story of scientists are people too.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say, I feel like this is a yes and moment. I think you should do all of that. And I think it's important not to let go of these everyday opportunities. So for example, I volunteer at the Smithsonian on the weekends here in DC. And part of what I do is I meet people and say, I'm a scientist and I would love to talk to you about this. I'm so excited that you're here today. And I entering a museum with children is the ultimate way to practice your science communication skills. I strongly recommend it. But I think that's a really more of an everyday part of your practice that you can engage in that is actually pretty easy and really fun, that can kind of really humanize you to your community.
So you mentioned hashtags. It raises a question about social media, and one of the questions we got was, do you have examples of effective use of social media to engage the public?
Yeah. So you may remember back in 2016 during the Olympics, the pool turned green, and that was everybody was talking about it. It was on the front page of the newspaper, this green pool, and what was going on. So one of the chemists that I know, Rachel Burks, actually capitalized on that and started tweeting about the chemistry behind the pool turning green. And so she was able to look at the sorts of hashtags people were using on social media, as well as actually replying to people who were talking about this, and give them a little bit more information about the chemistry behind the pool turning green. And that was a way to sort of engage people using an issue they are already interested in, already talking about, rather than trying to create something completely new.
Great example. Meg, there's uncertainty in science.
Yes.
How do you represent that uncertainty to the public without looking like you are debating yourself?
Right.
And that's a challenge because people think science has all the facts.
Right. That is, I think, one of the #1 questions I actually get from scientists, because we want to both share the credibility that we have, the weight of science that we have behind a lot of different topics, but also we are taught as scientists to acknowledge uncertainty, but the public maybe isn't taught to receive or process that uncertainty in the same way. And so my general piece of advice is to lead with what you know and then add the caveats where you need to. So if you start off saying, well, except for this case and this instance and this other thing and this other thing, aside from all of that, we know this, that's really going to undercut the statement that you're trying to make. And so I would say, as a rule of thumb, this is what happens. And there are occasional instances, like maybe this or this, that can happen that would change that. But this is what we know. And I think this is actually where some data can come in really effectively, is to back it up with a little bit of information, because statistics can be really powerful there to say, we did this thing that showed us these values or these percentages, and that's how we know this. And so bringing them into the process with you and showing them, I studied so many things, or I surveyed so many people, or whatever you did can actually add to your credibility. So again, don't leave uncertainty as, you need to acknowledge it, but there's a way to do it without undercutting what you're saying, I think.
Great. So we're almost out of time. I have one last question for you. If people want to find out more information, or where can they turn for additional resources, training, if they want to get better at this?
Yeah, so I listed a couple under my name. So if you go to AAAS.org/PES, that will bring you to the AAAS Public Engagement with Science resources. Also, Force for Science/Toolkit will bring, ForceForScience.org/toolkit will bring you to AAAS's Advocacy Toolkit. Both of those have really great resources about how to build your engagement, sort of how to figure out what your message is, what your goal is. And then also, if you're coming to the AAAS annual meeting, we offer a communicating science seminar on the Thursday, the first day of the meeting, which if you're already coming to the meeting, it's free otherwise to come to that seminar. And each year we feature different topics, like engaging sort of non-traditional science audiences.
I will add that you have Compass's website up there. We've got a lot of great resources. We have, I showed our message box earlier. We've got a great message box workbook online that kind of walks you through the process of actually how to fill that out and how to use it to help you sift through your information. We've got a great blog that's updated regularly. We also do offer training, so you can take a look at that information on our website. I'll also say you can email me, you can tweet at me. I'm sure you can do the same for Emily. We'd love to be resources for all of you, so don't be afraid to reach out. And yeah, so I really appreciate everyone tuning in and listening to what we have to say and engaging with these great questions.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both. I want to tell the people who are tuned in that we will make this webinar available on the ESEF website. That is located at science-engage.org. So you can go there and see not only this webinar, but past webinars. We'll also make sure to get the slides up, assuming you're willing to share them, so everybody can use them, because I think they're a great resource. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in, particularly thank Emily and Meg for joining us and providing such a useful set of information on how to communicate science to the public.
Well,
thank
you for having us.
Yep, great.